Topical debate and your reactions. Sunday Morning Live is back at 10:05. Now on BBC One, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak joins Laura Kuennsberg.
Good morning. What a year we have ahead.
They're off. This is not the general election campaign, honest. But look, two leaders trying to set their terms in the same couple of days.
I know many of you look ahead to 2023 with apprehension.
Should he be nervous?
We can feel the public looking at us again, and we won't let up.
He doesn't seem it. Look at the Tories polling and the NHS this Christmas. The prospects are truly grim. We have one big question this morning. Is Rishi Sunak the man to get a grip of both?
Prime Minister, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. There's a lot to talk about. In a few minutes, we'll hear that interview in full. Rishi Sunak on the health service, strikes and saving the Tory party. The man who wants to grab control of the NHS for Labour, Wes Streeting, is also here. And a spot of Sunday stardust. A man with plenty of gongs on his shelf, Sam Mendes, on his new movie and the real value of awards.
But the truth is, awards are a TV show. You know, awards are there to promote films. If that film wins an award, I'm more likely to go and see it.
To make sense of it all, the boss of one of the biggest hospitals in the country, Professor Clive Kay, is here. Top numbers man Andy Haldane, who was chief economist at the Bank of England, is with me. And we'll hear from the leader of the Nurses Union, Pat Cullen. Will Rishi Sunak say anything to make her call off the strikes? Welcome back. It's great to be with you for 2023. It seems unlikely we'll have three prime ministers like last year, and we'll hear today from the man who certainly hopes he'll hang on in a few minutes. But first, what are the papers leading on this morning? Well, across the piece, lots of focus on the health service, both the Sunday Times and the Observer talking about possible solutions to what many people call a crisis, but of course also more claims and allegations from Prince Harry after such a torrid week for the panel. Let's talk about, first of all, the NHS. Professor Kay, you run one of the biggest hospitals in the country, King's in London. We've heard health leader after health leader say this is really a crisis. Doctors saying this is the worst they've ever seen. Is that true?
Yes, Laura, I've been in the NHS close to 40 years. Every year's tough. Every year seems tougher than the last, but by some distance, this is the toughest time. My colleagues are doing their level best. They're doing an amazing job. They have since COVID in particular and throughout the pandemic. But it is now pretty relentless. And the reality is, we are having to carry out corridor care. We do have patients stuck in beds, and sometimes, and it's awful. We have patients in our A&E departments for several days. Everyone is trying really, really hard. But, you know, just to make it real, I was in our A&E department, one of our A&E departments on Friday evening, and I asked a nurse how it felt. She's an experienced nurse, and she said, I've been doing this job for 10 years, and now, after every shift, I go home and cry because I can't deliver the sort of care I used to be able to, or I should be able to, and that breaks my heart. Given how desperate it is, Pat Cullen, isn't it time for you to be ready to compromise on pay so that at least the strikes can be called off? Now, you've suggested maybe 10% might be a figure you'd accept. Is that true?
Well, what my words were, let's meet halfway. I think that's a significant move for the Royal College of Nursing, and it is in response to how we are responding to the pressures within the health service. It's not any nurse's intention to add to the risk or the pressures that patients are feeling, and indeed people like Clive that's trying to run a health service. So I think that's a significant move from this college. Now, as I've said time and time again now, the Prime Minister needs to grasp that nettle and get to a table with me. And we'll hear from him in just a few minutes. But Andy Haldane, the government's grappling with the NHS, but also an economy, you know, heading into recession. This year, is the country going to get richer or poorer?
Well, the economy probably starts in recession, Laura, morning. I suspect in the near term that bad situation will get a bit worse. Indeed, health will make that bad situation a little worse. It's possible, maybe even probable, that by the middle of the year we could see things beginning to brighten, but against a backdrop of first grim and then a bit grimmer in the near term.
OK, well, maybe not that much to be cheerful about at this stage, but a warning at the end of the programme. I do want you to think of something that might be a bit optimistic for this year. Thank you, all three of you, right now. Let's get on with our main event, because you won't have missed our political leaders this week trying to call the shots in their big formal speeches. But it's time to put your and our questions to them. Next week, Sir Keir Starmer will be here, but first up, Rishi Sunak. Now, we did invite him to come to the studio because we like you to be part of the conversation too. But instead, we were asked to go to number 10 last night to talk about the state of the nation, the state of the Tory party, and of course, the state of the health service. Simple starter for 10. Is the NHS in crisis?
The NHS is undeniably under enormous pressure. And I spent today talking to NHS leaders all day, in fact. It's an opportunity for me to say, first of all, thank you to them and their colleagues for the incredible job that they're doing, not just at the moment, but over the past 2 years. But recovering from COVID is going to be tough, and we're seeing that play out on our TV screens every day and in communities up and down the country. But actually, I came away from all my meetings today with a renewed sense of confidence and optimism that we can get to grips with this problem. I set it out as one of the 5 priorities I have earlier this week in the speech I made to the country. I want them to know that this is a top priority for me. And the good news is, across the country, as I was talking about today with colleagues, is there are so many fantastic examples of doctors, nurses, primary care teams that are able to overcome some of the challenges they're facing and make an enormous difference to their communities.
But you having a meeting in Downing Street today isn't going to be much comfort to the nearly 40,000 patients in November who had to wait more than 12 hours in A&E. And you saying you're grateful to staff today isn't going to be much comfort to the many, many, many families who have experienced terrible things in the last few weeks. Is it a crisis?
Well, as I said, the NHS is under pressure, but that's why, you just think, a few weeks after I became Prime Minister, we had the autumn statement. And in spite of the difficult decisions that we had to make in order to stabilise the economy, make sure that we get to grips with inflation and reduce debt, we managed to find more money for the NHS and social care, because I wanted to make sure everyone, including all the people that you talked about, knew that this was a priority, and that money is going into the system, and what we need to make sure is that money makes a difference.
But the level of service that many people have experienced in the last few weeks has been terrible. Doctors at their wits' end, nurses are at their wits' end. Some patients have been absolutely appalled by what's happened and have had terrible experiences. And I'm asking you about the word crisis, because sometimes I think people will only believe that you can get to grips with this if you acknowledge how bad it is. And the Royal College of Emergency Medicine has said that at least 300 people a week have died because of problems in overcrowding and emergency care. Now, if that's not a crisis, I ask you, what is?
Well, I think first thing to say is, when it comes to numbers like that, the NHS themselves have said that they don't recognise those numbers and would be careful about banding them around. But look, I think what matters more than words...
Them around.
Well,
that's
no,
the Royal
I think
College of Emergency Medicine. That's hardly some
Well, the
random
NHS,
group.
the NHS themselves have said that they don't recognise those numbers and will be careful about using them. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think what matters more than words is action. And here are the actions. 3 weeks after I became Prime Minister, in the autumn statement, at a time of difficulty elsewhere, billions of extra pounds for the NHS and social care. And then the next thing is, what difference is that going to make? And that's the question people should be asking. That's what I want to be held account for. So yes, there are unacceptable delays right now happening in ambulances and A&Es. But if you look at it, we've got actually a relatively small number of trusts, around 10% of trusts that account for over half of all the ambulance handover delays. And actually part of the discussions we were having today is figuring out, well, in the areas where we have managed to find ways to reduce some of the waiting pressures, what is it that's working that we can spread around around the country. And I'll give you an example, because I think the really thing is, what are we going to do? The number one problem we've got at the moment is there are around 13,000 people in hospitals who ideally should be back in their communities in social care or home settings. And recently we've put an extra £500 million in over this winter in a discharge fund.
On that
and
500 million then? On that 500 million,
will speed
how
the
much of that
transition.
has been spent already?
Well, actually, funny enough, we're just getting the returns back from, and we were talking about that today, we were getting the returns back from all the local areas about, well, that money's gone to local areas. What we need to make sure is it's being spent in the right way. And then clearly one of the conversations I had with health leaders today is making sure that money is well spent, because where it is being well spent, it is making a difference, and you can start to see some of that pressure ease, people being moved back into their communities. But I'll give you another example, because again, this is really practical. And how can we ease some of the pressures? We need to use more virtual wards, for example. Another thing we discuss, where we can move people out of hospital into what are called virtual wards, for particularly people who have acute respiratory illnesses, who can be monitored remotely with pulse oximeters and other things. That's something that clinicians are leading on, and it's making an enormous difference.
But those are both things that can happen in the future. And I understand that you want to focus on things that can be done in the future. But I think a lot of people looking at what's happened in the NHS in the last couple of months will just think, in fact, a viewer got in touch with me today saying, please ask the Prime Minister this, how have you let this happen? Because NHS leaders have been warning about this winter for months and months and months. And yes, you announced more money, and you announced more money in September, but right now in the last couple of weeks, in the 6th biggest economy in the world, people have been waiting and waiting and waiting for ambulances to come and pick them up at a time of terrible emergency. People have been waiting more than 12 hours for a bed. You know, there are countless stories around that like this. How have you let this happen?
So again, I just go, when you say that these things are in the future, they're not. They're things that we can make a difference on right now. So we can do more virtual wards right now. We can discharge people faster out of hospitals into social care right now with the funding that we're putting in. We can figure out the best practice on ambulance triage so that we can stop people having to come to A&E in the first place who don't need to be there if they've had falls, for example, and can be treated at home. We can do that right now because it's already happening in many parts of the country. But what we need to do is spread that to all the other parts of the country where it's not happening. So those are the things that I am focused on. And I think it's not right to ignore the impact that COVID has had. And the reality is that for 2 years, the NHS had to stop doing lots of things that it normally does, whether it's treating people for cancer because they weren't being referred, whether it was carrying out elective surgery. And unsurprisingly, once we get back to normal, all of those treatments come back at a pace that was anticipated, but is obviously very significant. So yes, has the NHS had pressures before? Of course it has. But COVID has undeniably had an enormous difference, and it's wrong to ignore that. But what we are doing is actually putting more money in, making sure that the initiatives work, and starting to improve some of these wait times.
You're right, it would be ridiculous to deny that COVID and flu this winter have had an impact. But things were going in the wrong direction well before the pandemic. The target for people to be seen in A&E within 4 hours has not been met since 2015. Waiting lists were already going up to extremely high levels over the last few years. Bed numbers have gone down, staff shortages have gone up. I ask you again, you were warned about this repeatedly by whether it's unions, health leaders, whatever. Things were going wrong long before the pandemic. And don't you have to acknowledge that if you want to fix it?
Well, I think just gently I'd point out, if you look right now, you mentioned A&E waiting times, absolutely right to focus on those. In Wales and in Scotland, for example, they're operating at worse levels than they are in England. That's 3 different governments, all of whom care about the NHS, all of whom are trying to make a difference.
I'm not making a political point about who's getting it wrong. I'm saying you're the Prime Minister of this country, and people are watching what's happening in A&E,
and what they're seeing
and they feel
is
desperate.
And what they want to know is what's going to make a difference to it. And what I'm saying and sitting here and telling you about are the things we are doing that are going to improve the situation. Now, I can't help that COVID happened. I can't help that there are now thousands of people in hospitals who normally would not be there. But we are making a difference in moving them back to social care settings or their homes as quickly as possible. We are learning best practice from those trusts that are doing things differently and reducing ambulance delays and spreading that around the country. We are doing more treatment of people with falls outside of hospital. Now, look, are those things all going to make a difference overnight? Of course they're not. But they are going to make a difference soon, and this is one of my key priorities.
Well, you say soon,
So when? Because ambulance delays, for example, are at record levels. So when do you think what you're talking about can make a difference?
Well, I'm not going to sit here and say that this can be promised and solved overnight, because it's not going to be.
But when can people expect a difference? Because you're saying, I've got solutions, listen to my solutions, but when will they make a difference?
Well, for example, on waiting lists, for example, where we have very clear, where we've got a plan that we've got in place that we're making sure that we can actually deliver. So actually last year we eliminated practically the number of people waiting over 2 years. I'm confident that in a few months' time we will have practically eliminated those people who are waiting a year and a half for their treatment, because we're working to the plan that we've put in place. And by next spring, I'm confident that we will practically eliminate all those people waiting over a year, and waiting lists will actually be falling. Now, when it comes to urgent and emergency care, we're working through, as I've done all day today with health leaders, to see what are the things that we can do that can make a difference in the short term. That's the work that's going on now. I can't sit here and tell you it will happen by next week, but what I can tell you is the situation in many places is already improving, and what we want to do is learn from that and make sure that more places can benefit from that type of good practice.
Would it have helped if the Conservative Party hadn't had 4 changes of Health Secretary in 6 months?
Well, what I can tell you is what I've done since I've been Prime Minister.
But would that have helped?
Well, I don't think that would have made any difference to the fact that we had a pandemic for 2 years. Right? I mean, that's the reality of what we're dealing with. If the health service for 2 years had to focus on COVID and stop having people come and be referred with cancer, if it stopped having to do elective surgery rightly to focus on a different priority, it's not about who the health secretary was, it's about a pandemic that happened that we're now having to recover from.
Can you ever fix the problems with social care when care workers get paid around £18,000 a year, which you know is well below the average wage?
Well, what we are doing with some of the extra money that we've put into social care is actually support the social care workforce, who do an incredible job, and we should all be very grateful. I'm very grateful to them. And one of the things that we prioritised was making sure that people in that workforce do feel valued, and importantly have a sense of...
But if their wages don't go up, I mean, that's how people often feel valued.
If you're talking to people today and talking to people over the last couple of years, there's a range of different things we can do to ensure people working in social care do feel valued. And part of that actually is giving them a sense of qualifications, professional training and development, and a sense of career progression. These aren't things that have happened properly in the past, but because of the extra funding that we're putting in, all of those things are going to be delivered. And when I'm out and about talking to people, they do value those things. It's not just about how much people are paid.
Would you do a job as a care worker for £18,000 a year?
Well, the job I'm doing is making a difference to the country as Prime Minister, and that's why this week I set out the priorities that I believe the country has that I'm going to focus on, which is about halving inflation, it's about growing the economy, it's about reducing debt, it's about cutting waiting lists, and it's about stopping the boats. Those are the priorities that I have as Prime Minister.
Just on stopping the boats, as you raise it there, stopping the channel crossings, what's your actual target? Because I know you've promised to pass legislation, but what's your actual target? Are you going to make sure that everybody who arrives goes somewhere else, has to leave the country, or everybody is detained? What is your actual target, just briefly?
Yeah, so the system that we want to put in place is very clear. My view is if you come here illegally, you should not have the right to stay, and you will be detained and then swiftly removed either to your home, if it's appropriate, or indeed to a safe third alternative. That should apply to everybody who comes here illegally. That's a very straightforward system. I think it's a common sense system that the vast majority of people will think is reasonable and will support. But we need new laws to implement that system, and those are the laws that we will bring forward early this year.
But there's no specific target there. That's a system you want to introduce rather than a specific target.
Well, the target is we want to stop illegal migration, but we can't do that unless we pass these new laws and have that type of system in place and the powers for us to enable us to do that. And I'm confident we can deliver it if we can pass the legislation, and that will be a question for Parliament. But again, that's something that we've already made progress on. In the several weeks that I've had the job, we've got new deals with France, new deals with Albania, so we've got more patrols happening on French beaches. That's a positive. We've not had that degree of involvement before. Albania accounted for a third almost of illegal migrant arrivals last year. Albania is obviously a safe country. Other European countries return illegal migrants to Albania. We were not doing that sufficiently. With the new deal that I've negotiated and the changes that we are making, we will also be able to make a difference there.
Were you registered with a private GP, and are you still?
Yeah, but my dad was a doctor. I grew up in an NHS family.
Wasn't my question. It's really straightforward. Were you registered with a private GP?
I mean, I've made as a general policy, I wouldn't ever talk about me or my family's healthcare situation. But again, it's not really relevant to this. What's relevant is the difference I can make to the country.
Well, hang on, Prime Minister. I think there is huge public interest in the decisions that you make. And actually one of your predecessors, who I know you admire very much, Margaret Thatcher, she said very openly that she decided to use her right as a free citizen to spend my money in my own way so that I can go on in the day at the time with the doctor I choose and get out fast. She was perfectly happy and probably proud to talk about the decision she made. Why wouldn't you tell people if you use private healthcare?
Well, I mean, it's just a personal choice. It's about healthcare, I think, is somewhat that is private. But I think what people care about is, am I going to make a difference on the thing that they care about? When it comes to the NHS, I mean, I grew up in an NHS family. I said my dad was a GP, my mum was a pharmacist, and I think my track record matters more than these things. But what I would say is that I want to make sure that we do have fantastic healthcare for everybody.
And you've made that
claim. The role of the private sector.
But
this is really important.
There is a public interest in the decisions that the Prime Minister makes for himself. Why won't you tell us whether or not you use private healthcare?
But again, it's a distraction from what the real issue is. And the real issue is, are we making sure that there's high quality healthcare available for the country? But when it comes to the private sector in general, we should be making use of the independent sector. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. For example, with elective surgery, one of the things we do need to do is actually be much more open to using the independent sector capacity that is available and putting power in the hands of patients to choose where they want to have that treatment. That's something that we need to do more of.
What should the NHS do less of? Because some people look at the system right now and think, you know what? It can't go on providing more and more and more, and for a population that's getting older and older and older, when partly because of some of the amazing advances in healthcare, it's also becoming more and more expensive. So are there things that the NHS should stop doing?
But it's not about what it should stop doing, it's about making sure that we treat people in the right places. And I think that's the thing that we need to do a better job of, because there's lots of people who are in hospital who don't need to be there. And that's about making sure that we intervene earlier on, or we put people on the pathway to getting the care in their home or in their community, or making better use of whether it's pharmacists or other new primary care workers that we have.
But your health secretary said, interestingly, that the NHS should do fewer things. They should prioritise the important things and do fewer things. Is he wrong?
Well, I think right now we know what the important things that we should be focused on, and I've been very clear about what they are. We need to make sure that we do focus on waiting lists, and we've got a clear plan to do that. We do want to ease some of the pressures in emergency care, and we want to improve access to primary care.
Do you categorically rule out paying nurses more this year?
But when it comes to nurses, I mean, as first thing I'd say is thank you to all of them for the job that they are doing, not just at the moment, but over the past 2 years.
And they don't want to thank you, they want more money.
I think actually, it's important they recognise that the work they do is appreciated, and I'm grateful and the government is grateful for it. I think that is important to say, because they do a great job and they have worked incredibly hard under difficult circumstances. And that's why we want to have a reasonable, honest, two-way conversation about pay and everything else.
You do want to have a conversation about pay, because up until now, well, that's different.
That's always been the case. The door has always been open to talk about things that the nurses want to talk about and the unions want to talk about more generally, which is why actually we just wrote to all the unions from across the public sector, inviting them in for talks, and those talks are happening in many sectors on Monday, which is great. And when it comes to pay, we've always said we want to talk about things that are reasonable, that are affordable and responsible for the country.
But you could decide right here, right now, to bring the nurses' strike to an end by saying, let's talk about giving you more pay this year. So I know you're having union talks on Monday, but that's about next year's pay settlement. They've been crystal clear that they believe they have to be paid more this year. And unless the government says, let's talk about pay right here, right now, the strikes will go on. So how do you bring an end to this?
Well, the first thing we need to do is start talking properly, and that's why Monday is really important, and we want to have these conversations. We want them to be honest, we want them to be...
But for clarity, will you talk about this year's pay deal on Monday with the unions?
So the most important thing is to be talking.
About this year's pay?
It wouldn't be right for me to sit here and start having negotiations in public with you or anyone else.
No, but forgive me, we have to be really clear about this, because up until now, government ministers have said that they will not discuss pay for this year. That's what people have been saying. Are you today saying something different? Are you saying, yes, let's talk about pay for this year?
The government has always been clear that it's happy to talk about pay that is responsible, that's affordable for the country. That's always been clear. But we have to look now. We're about to start a new pay settlement round for this year. Right, we're about to start that independent process, and before that process starts, the government is keen to sit down with the unions and talk about pay and make sure that they understand where we're coming from. That's why we've published very transparently all the evidence we have on what's affordable.
But I'm just a bit confused about this, because I just want to be really, really clear, as a yes or no question, a yes or no answer if you can. Will you talk to nurses about increasing pay this year? Yes or no?
We are about to start that process.
But that's about next year. But
no, that's literally about the year that we're about to start.
But that, is it not financial year 23, 24? They want to talk about pay this year.
We're about to have that conversation. Now, look, when it comes to pay, as I said, it's not appropriate for those conversations to happen in public, but the most important thing is that we are talking. And that's why we've invited all the union leaders from across the public sector in to have those conversations. When it comes to pay, again, important for everyone to remember, we have an independent pay setting process for a reason, because these conversations are difficult.
Which governments have sometimes ignored, but it sounds like the government position on all of this is moving a little bit, but we have lots to talk about.
You say governments have sometimes ignored. In this instance, the government, across the board, has accepted the recommendations of independent bodies when it comes to pay.
We must move on, because I want to talk about the economy. You've promised to have inflation. Now, that was predicted to happen anyway. You've promised that the economy will stop shrinking by the end of the year. Some people in your party, and maybe some Tory voters, might think of that and think, where's the ambition?
Well, when it comes to inflation, you say it's predicted to happen anyway. That doesn't happen automatically. It happens because of the plans that we've put in place. Right? It's because of the decisions that we've took in the autumn statement and that we need to stick to. So we've just been having a conversation about pay. Well, making sure that we meet those inflation targets, that we do ease the burden on the cost of living, is a function of having a responsible economic policy when it comes to things like pay, when it comes to areas like borrowing. So that's why it's not a given that it just happens. You have to continue to be disciplined and make the right responsible decisions in order to bring inflation down. It's really important that we do. It's not an abstract thing. It's impacting people's pockets every single day with the cost of living. And we can't help anybody, whether it's nurses or everyone else, unless we get inflation down, and that's why it's one of our 5 priorities.
But some people in your party, and many Tory voters, I think, might look at what you've done and think, well, the tax burden is at the highest it's been ever. And they don't feel excited about what you're putting forward as the economy, and they think, oh, it's not really proper Conservative.
Well, I think it's a deeply conservative thing to have an economy that is built on low inflation and sound public finances. I mean, you brought up Margaret Thatcher earlier in this interview. It was something that was incredibly important to her, which you can read about in speech after speech. So I think it is a deeply conservative thing to make sure the economy is managed responsibly, that inflation is brought back to where it belongs, that borrowing is responsible, so we're not burdening the future generations with debt, and that we are growing the economy and providing jobs for everybody everywhere. You know, those are my priorities. When I talked about the 5 promises I made the country, to halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the boats. I mean, there's a pretty clear set of deliverables there. Those are the things that matter to the country. Those are the things that matter to me, and that's what we're going to deliver. I think they are both right for the country and also deeply conservative.
We are running short of time, but we don't often get the chance to talk like this, so I'm going to ask you a couple of specific things, if I may, and I'd love to ask a little bit about how you were finding the job too. John Major was called on to help work things out when things got very difficult between Prince Charles, as was, and Lady Diana. If you were asked to help a royal reconciliation, would you be willing to?
I would always just not comment on matters to do with the royal family. But
there's a precedent here. Prime Minister previously was called on to help. Now, if you were called on to help, would you? Surely you wouldn't say that.
I would never ever comment on matters to do with the royal family.
But people look to you for leadership as the Prime Minister, and I know you don't want to get into the family rows, but for the public, how can the British public have faith in that institution when they see this dysfunction, allegations of fighting and betrayal at the top? Do you think the public can still have faith in the monarchy?
I think the public, like me, have enormous regard for the royal family and are deeply proud of them. I certainly am. It's one of the things that I'm most proud of when I think about what it is to be British, when I get to go around the world and champion Britain as an amazing country with so many things that we can be proud of. Our institutions, including the royal family, are one of those.
Do you think the institution has been damaged by this whole saga then?
I said, look, in general, I wouldn't get into talking about the royal family, but it's something that I'm proud of and I think the country is proud of. And we saw that last year, I think very movingly, multiple times, and I'm confident that we'll actually see it this year with King Charles's coronation, which will be another fantastic occasion for the country to come together and celebrate something special about Britain and recognise what is happening, which is something to celebrate.
You are the youngest Prime Minister at 42 in a very long time, but we're in the 13th year of Conservative rule. There's a whole generation that's come of age during that time when rents have gone through the roof, childcare has become extortionate, they're paying more and more tax, owning a house is further and further out of reach. The polls suggest that you're someone very unusual in your early 40s who fancies voting Conservative. Why would anyone under 45 vote Conservative?
I think that the country's priorities are pretty clear, and those are to make sure that we do manage the economy responsibly. That's the thing that's going to make a difference to everybody, whatever age you are. You talked about buying a house. It's going to be harder to buy a house if interest rates are higher. Well, why are interest rates going to be higher? It's because inflation is higher. So the best thing we can do to help that generation is to get interest rates down, and that means getting inflation down, which is why the first priority I set out this year was to halve inflation. The second priority I set out was to grow the economy, because I want there to be fantastic jobs in every part of the country for all those young people. You talked about the next generation. We shouldn't burden them with debts. That's why it's important that we reduce borrowing a debt. That's the third promise I made. And then the last two are important to them too, where it's about cutting waiting lists and stopping the boats. I think everyone cares about those. Everyone has a family member that at any point in time is reliant on the NHS, whether it's a grandparent who needs a hip operation, whether it's someone who's had to be rushed to emergency care, or someone who just needs to see the GP for their kid's ear infection. So having a really well-performing NHS is important to everybody. And stopping the boats is about fairness. And I think that is a value that everyone in this country believes in, regardless of what age you are. And having a system which is seen as unfair because people are abusing it isn't the right thing. It's not the right long-term thing for this country, and that's why those are the right priorities.
I think we're going to keep hearing a lot about these 5 pledges in the coming months, but we are not that far off from a general election. Just finally, I mean, the polls put you in a worse position than the government was during the worst days of Partygate, when you were still next door, or maybe it's that way to number 11, I'm not sure of my geography. Some of your colleagues in Parliament think that there's no way back for the Conservative Party now, and actually being out of office for a while to renew, have a think, dust yourselves down and work out what you really stand for is the best option. Do you fear, if the polls are correct at the moment, do you fear a sort of 1997 style wipeout on your watch?
What the country wants is a government that is focused on the things that matter to them. I think their priorities are clear, and that's why they're my priorities. And I set them out very clearly this week. And our plan and my plan is to deliver on them. And I think actually if we can halve inflation and grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the boats, then the country will recognise that. But that's all that I'm focused on. It's about delivering for the country on the things that matter to them.
Just lastly, what do you say then to people in your party who rather hope that, some of them, that the future might feature your old boss, Boris Johnson? What do you say to people who quite fancy him making a comeback?
I think what everyone in our party wants is they want the country's priorities to be met. And they want the Conservative Party and the Conservative government to do a good job of delivering for the British people. And right now, what the British people want are the things that we've promised to do. And it's to halve inflation, to grow the economy, to reduce debt, to cut waiting lists, to stop the boats. Those are the things that matter to the country. Those are the things that matter to me and the Conservative government. And this year, people will see us really work our socks off to deliver for them.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for talking to us and for being so generous with your time.
Thanks for having me.
Now, tons to get into, and I'm sure that Rishi Sunak's refusal to tell us whether he has private healthcare will get a lot of people going. But Pat Cullen, you're the leader of the Nurses Union. More strikes are planned. Now, the Prime Minister there didn't say he's going to give you more money, but he did signal a willingness for the first time to talk about this year's pay. Has he opened the door to you doing a deal, do you think?
Well, when I listened to that, there was a chink of optimism, and there was a little shift in what the Prime Minister was saying. However, and this is really important, tomorrow's meeting, first of all, General Secretaries are not at the table tomorrow.
So you won't be at this big
union meeting tomorrow? We will be
tomorrow.
there, but not, General Secretaries won't be there. So this is not about negotiations tomorrow. It's not about nurses' pay, and it's not addressing the issues that are our dispute, and that is addressing pay for 22-23. However, we will be there. We'll put our case, But what the government want to talk about tomorrow is pay moving forward and in the broadest terms. And that is not going to avert the strike action that's planned for 10 days' time.
So we can see now some pictures of you being on the picket line on the last days of strike action. But I'm interested there that you do sound, whatever the specifics of tomorrow's meeting, you have said there's a chink of optimism. Do you detect, maybe not just from that interview, but generally, do you think the government is moving?
Well, the Prime Minister talked about coming to the table. Now, that's a move for me because I have said, let's meet halfway. Grasp at the nettle, come to the table. I can't negotiate on my own, and I can't negotiate on the airwaves. So if that table is now available, I will be there on behalf of the over 300,000 members that participated in this ballot.
Okay.
But it must be about addressing pay for 2022-23.
And that's what we were trying to clarify from him. I did my best to get clarification of exactly what he meant there. Professor Kay, you run one of the biggest hospitals in the country, and we were asking the Prime Minister there, I suppose, really whether he understands the gravity of the situation. Did it sound to you like he understands it?
No, if I'm being honest, I think he seemed to focus rather more on the fact that we're doing well on elective recovery, and I think, to be fair, we are doing pretty well on elective recovery.
Catching up on planned operations and
that
things
is
like
indeed,
that.
although it's got to be said, even at King's, for example, where we've had a peak one point of 7,000 patients waiting over a year, that's down to 800. Great improvement still, for those patients waiting long periods of time, that's very significant, and that is put at risk because of the current pressures we're under. I don't think I heard quite the grasp of the fact that this is a really, really difficult situation. The only thing I'd say, though, Laura, is this is not a one-off. This is not a quick fix. This is not just a winter 22-23 problem. There's going to be quite a time to fix this, and I think we need some realistic conversations about the situation we're in, how difficult it is, what the public can expect, and I think the suggestion that there's going to be a quick fix, a sticking plaster here, it's not a reality.
Now, Andy Haldane, I know you're an economist by trade, but you've been around the political world for a long time. It was very striking that Rishi Sunak didn't want to get into the question of whether or not he uses private healthcare. Does it matter to you if he does or not?
I think there's absolutely a case for people coming clean and for being clear about that. I think per se it need not matter people's private choices, provided there's clarity about that and provided that doesn't detract from their views on the public provision of health.
Pat, did it bother you?
I think as a public servant, you ought to be clear with the public whether or not you are using private health cover. That's about being open, it's about being transparent, and it's about honesty. And those are characteristics that if you were, I suppose, talking to the public, which I've done over this last while on picket lines, that are characteristics that seem to be missing at the minute. And I think he needed to come clean. As a public servant, he's elected by the public, so he is accountable to the public. And when you're accountable to the public, you have to be honest with them.
Now, Andy Haldane, he's also accountable on the economy, OK? Now, I was asking him there about whether or not what he's doing, trying to get inflation down, trying to get the debt down, really adds up to a sort of true Conservative programme, because there are lots of people, maybe lots of people watching this morning, lots of Tory voters, certainly lots of Tory MPs who think it's all a bit soggy centrist. Now, from your analysis of what the government's up to, is it a proper Conservative programme?
Well, I think as things stand, Laura, it's not really a growth programme at all.
At all?
I think we're currently short that piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which is what is the plan that's going to boost growth over the medium term, enable now pay to pick up, allow public service to be paid for and financed properly, the debt to be paid down. We're still missing that. There were hints of it in the Prime Minister's speech earlier in the week, and indeed from the Leader of Opposition's speech earlier in the week. That is still falling somewhat short, though, of that plan.
Did he have any choice, though? I mean, in the months before Christmas, we talked a lot in this studio about how, the government had to take what they thought was emergency action, after all the fireworks of Liz Truss. Do you, as an economist, do they have any choice right now but to do what they're doing, just trying to rebuild things brick by brick?
Well, listen, stabilising the ship absolutely was the first priority end of last year. But this is the year where optimism and innovation and investment will only happen if people have some sense of a brighter tomorrow for the economy. That's the main reason why businesses are holding back in investing right now. That's why the plan really matters. Put in place today with expectations for improvement tomorrow.
And just quickly, you were somebody who at the Bank of England was kind of, say, in a minority for a long time, shouting about the risk of inflation. Can you tell people this morning when you think it's going to start coming down in a way that we'll all feel?
I think it's peaked in headline terms already. So this year will be the year where inflation falls off, if for no other reason, Laura, than the fact that last year's energy price rises will drop out of the annual comparison. Nonetheless, underlying here is a still very tight labour market, lots of unfilled vacancies that is putting upwards pressure on pay, and that for me will lead to inflation remaining above its 2% target for some little while yet.
The strikes, though, across so many sectors, and we've all seen them in the last few weeks, whether it's nurses, whether it's rail, whether it's posties, whether it's all these different sectors. What cost is that kind of industrial action having to the economy, do you think?
It is having some cost in disruption, for sure. It's having some cost. But to be clear here, the underlying problem is not strikes per se. It's a shortage of people. We are short of people in this country, not just in the NHS, but in pretty much every sector and pretty much every region. That's what is causing the problems. That is what is putting upwards pressure on pay. That is what is causing the underlying cost of living crisis.
But Pat, when you hear, though, that the disruption to the economy and of course the disruption to our viewers that all these strikes are causing, I mean, this isn't a political game for the unions, and it seems at the moment that most of the public is on the side of the nurses, but there are people who are looking at what's happening and thinking, this isn't a game, get back to work. What do you say to them?
No, it doesn't feel like a game for any nurse. Absolutely not. And Laura, we've had 2 days of strike, and it was the hardest thing that I've done in my 42 years of nursing. There's absolutely no nurse wants to do this, but nurses are getting poorer. They cannot manage to survive on the wages that this government is giving them, and they are not being listened to. So something has to give here, and the only way that it appears that this government is going to listen to the people that are holding this health service together is to actually use their voice and stand on picket lines and say enough is enough.
Clive, as a hospital boss, how do you see this situation? I know you're not one of the people in the negotiating room, we should be clear about that, but what's your take on this? You've got to grapple with the reality.
Yeah, well, I think, look, as you say, I'm a hospital chief executive. I'm not involved directly in pay negotiation, but it is one of my duties to ensure that my colleagues are rewarded fairly for the job they do. I see the amazing work that nurses do day in and day out. I am fully aware of the impact of the cost of living crisis on them, and I say 2 things. I think we should reward them. We should reward them. And I think the second thing I'd say is we know pretty much from history these sort of disputes are only ever resolved by people getting around the table. For the sake of our staff and our patients and the situation we're in now, we should do that sooner rather than later.
OK, we'll watch this space. Let's see whether or not Pat Cullen and Rishi Sunak will get in a room before too long. Thank you all very much for now. Of course, we do want to hear what you think of what the Prime Minister said. You can email us at the normal address, kuennsberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay. Now, maybe it's time to sit back and relax a bit, maybe grab some popcorn, because I've been talking to one of the most successful Brits around. Hollywood and starry stage director Sir Sam Mendes. His epic production about the Lehman Brothers, remember them, has come back in glory from the United States to the UK, and his new film Empire of Light is about to open in cinemas. It takes you right back to the torrid atmosphere of the early 80s, if you're old enough to remember it like me. But it's a personal story too. It delves into a middle-aged woman struggling with a mental breakdown, an echo of Sir Sam's own mum's story. And that character is played by that huge star, Olivia Colman. Here he is.
Did I humiliate myself?
What?
Tell me, did I?
No, it wasn't humiliating. It was just intense. To be honest, I thought you were a bit of a hero.
That's very nice of you. Hard to believe.
The stigma that is still attached to mental illness, there's still a cloak of darkness that's thrown over it. You know, if you come out of hospital and you've just recovered from, say, cancer, I'm immediately saying to you, how are you? Yeah. If you come out of a mental health facility, I don't talk about it. I probably don't ask you the question. So there's still that strange stigma attached to it. And my goal primarily in the movie was to try and dramatize the effect and what it is to live through bipolar and manic depression, rather than to explain it.
Hillary, please open the door.
You know, there's a scene where they're banging on her door to take her out to a mental hospital, and she's fighting with every fibre of her being to not go in, and yet she has already packed her bag because she knows she needs help. And it's possible, that state of denial, to believe both things, to not want to go in and to need to go at the same time. And that was what I was trying to articulate in the film.
And she sits with her coat on.
Yeah, she knows they're coming and she knows she has to go.
It is also a love story. There are sex scenes in it, and Olivia Colman, I saw talking about the film, said she begged you to take them out. As a director, why do we still need to actually have sex scenes in films?
Well, she didn't actually beg me to take them out. She was joking when she said that, and I think that got pulled out of context. She was very embarrassed about performing the sex scenes, as is often the case. I suppose the answer to your question is because you're seeing people at their rawest, at their most emotionally vulnerable. And it's like anything, you're trying to push a little further into the places that you're not normally allowed to go into. You know, you're going behind the curtain, as it were. And I wanted to see their physical desire.
You are also paying tribute to the cinema and its role as a place in a community, as well as the sort of act of going to the cinema and watching films. But if you look at our high streets now, even if you look at the balances of huge, big multiplex companies, I mean, Cineworld's just going under. Why do you think cinema's struggling to get people through the door?
The problem is trying to keep the event of going to the cinema, the destination, the specialness of it. And I think that puts demands on the movie makers to make movies that need to be seen on the big screens. When I made 1917, I was actively wanting to make a movie that was immersive and you experienced in a different way when you were sitting in a big cinema. With this movie, is there a big difference between experiencing a cinema and seeing it on streaming? There's less of a difference. But then I look back at my films and I think, well, American Beauty, Revolutionary Road, Away We Go, these would all go to streaming now. Really? And that makes me sad. Yeah, I think so. I think so, because I think those middle budget movies don't get made for cinemas anymore. And you look at the multiplexes and people go, oh, there's 6 screens. And then you go to those 6 screens and it says screen 1, Avatar, screen 2, Avatar, screen 3, Avatar. You know, that's not a 6-screen cinema. That's just 6 screens showing the same movie. And that is a different understanding of why those buildings were created in the first place. What it means is filmmakers have to accept and embrace the ambition of a big screen and make things that need to be seen on the big screen. Or they accept that they're going to be seen by millions of people on streaming, which is no bad thing. But the 20th century, the great era of movies, the great entertainment form, which was going out to the movies, that is dying.
Let's talk about another art form. I mean, you're one of the few creatives, perhaps, who's managed to, you know, they have this double whammy of success of keeping a really successful foot in theatre and a hugely successful foot in cinema. You're bringing the Lehman trilogy back to London.
He had been dreaming of America. 3 brothers. Travellers, immigrants. They came with nothing, not even a word of English, and they built an entire universe.
And it's this truly epic story. Crucially, only 3 actors who play throughout the span of more than a century. They must play dozens of parts between them, and all ages, all genders, all different kinds of people. Do you think any actor can play any role?
Depends on the kind of play. I think that, you know, the joy of theatre, particularly after the literalness of movies in many ways, is that you unlock an audience's imagination. And the moment you have in Lehman someone turn around and play an 18-year-old girl or play somebody that's patently not, and even the character, their core characters, you know, Simon Russell Beale was playing Henry, now Nigel Lindsay in the West End revival, a man who died in his 30s. Well, they're both actors in their 50s, you know. But it didn't matter because it releases the imagination. And I think that if you find the right form, anyone can play anything.
A young actor, Emma Corrin, suggested recently that at the Oscars, the gender-based categories should go. There should just be gender-neutral categories. For the awards, I mean, as somebody who's no stranger to picking up the odd statuette, would that be sensible? Do you have sympathy with that idea?
I have total sympathy with it, yeah, and I think it might well be inevitable in the end.
Really? Why?
Because I think that's the way it's moving, and I think that it's perfectly reasonable to, you know, I mean, for me, people forget with awards. I think this happens all the time. They use it as a bellwether for the industry, but the truth is awards are a TV show. You know, awards are there to promote films. If that film wins an award, I'm more likely to go and see it. And that's what you're doing there. It's not about yourself, it's not about the art or craft of the industry especially, it's about selling films.
Is that easy for someone to say who's won an awful lot of them, to dismiss the importance of them?
I'm not dismissing the importance of them, but I'm saying that they were there to promote films and the craft and art of films. They're the shop window, but they're not the thing itself.
You have spoken out before about this government's attitude to arts funding. If the Prime Minister was sitting in here, what would you say to him?
What I would say to him is please try and correct the wrongs of the last year, and now please look properly at how to fund this. It's not, you're not asking for a fortune, but the gradual erosion of the arts in this country over the last 10 years has been a scandal. So the headline is, oh, London should have one less opera company, which seems to be the way that people have taken it. But really it's about destroying the texture and the fabric of the arts that have been built up for decades by people who really care and really know about it and are passionate. It's across the board, and it's not just the subsidised theatres, it's the commercial theatres, it's the independent producers, it's theatre in the community, it's all sorts of things and outreach schemes, and it's a single organism. So, you know, I of course complain about the Donmar because the Donmar was the theatre that I founded.
Close to your heart, yeah.
And I love it, but you know, I can see that that's a very glamorous West End theatre, but it's not just that, it's across the board. And the idea that the 24 million they've taken and robbed from these theatres in London is going to somehow solve the problem of arts not being funded in the regions is ridiculous. It's just two wrongs don't make a right.
Okay, Sam Mendes, thank you so much for talking to us. It's been a real pleasure.
It's a pleasure, thanks Laura.
Now, someone who's keen to stop being an understudy in our political dramas is Wes Streeting, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, who's back in the studio with us for the new year. Thanks for coming in. Do you use private healthcare?
No, and I thought the Prime Minister in that interview gave the impression of someone who not only doesn't use the NHS, but doesn't understand the scale of the challenges or have a plan to deal with the fundamental problems. Because yes, he can get people around the table in number 10 for a photo op. Yes, he can do more sticking plasters to get us through this winter. But we need fundamental change in the NHS to deal with what is the biggest crisis in its history, and that's what Labour's looking to do.
But if people can afford private healthcare, and if indeed Rishi Sunak perhaps is paying for private healthcare, if people can afford it, is there anything wrong with that?
Well, one of the things I've got a concern with is because the NHS is in such a mess, we've got a two-tier healthcare system in this country at the moment, where those who can afford to pay to go private do, and those who can't are left behind. That's why Labour said we would use...
people making that choice? So we'll come on to your plans, but is there anything wrong with people making that choice?
No, it's a free country. People can make that choice. But I want to make sure that people, whether they can afford it or not, get access to great quality healthcare in this country, free at the point of need. That's what's great about the NHS. What isn't great about the NHS at the moment is that more than a decade of Conservative mismanagement has left us with huge waiting lists, the largest in history. 2 million people at last count waiting more than a month to see their GP back in October. The NHS is in crisis, and we need a plan to fix the fundamentals, not just do more sticking plasters, or worse still, to run the service down to the point where the NHS no longer exists.
But if you were in government, Labour would actually give a lot of cash to the private sector. I mean, you're saying this weekend that nearly 250,000 more patients would be treated by the private sector. There's some people in your party, some people in the union movement, who think, hang on a minute, why would a Labour government get taxpayers to top up the profits of corporate big companies?
Well, let me take that head on. How could I look someone in the eye who's waiting for an operation and say that spare bed over there that can, and in that hospital that can treat you is available, but because of my left-wing principles, I'm not willing to fund you to go and access that bed free at the point of use through the NHS. I want to see people treated as fast as possible. If there is spare capacity in the private sector, we will use it. The last Labour government did that, and Laura, do you know what? We made the NHS so good at the same time that use of the private sector fell off a cliff under the last Labour government. I want to make the NHS so good that people never feel they have to pay to go private.
But hang on a minute, Wes Streeting, aren't you actually then saying a mixed message? You know, you're saying that whether, you know, Rishi Sunak seems like he doesn't understand it, and if he's going private, he doesn't understand what's really going on and he doesn't use it. But at the same time, you would want to use the private sector more for people to change this way the service works.
I would absolutely use the private sector in the short term to get NHS waiting lists down, free at the point of use through the NHS. The last Labour government did that successfully at the same time as fixing the fundamentals. That's why we've got a plan to deliver the biggest expansion of NHS staff training in history, funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status. Rishi Sunak knows all about that too. He could nick that plan if he wants to, but he's not fixing the fundamentals. And in addition, we've got to look, why is it that our hospitals are overloaded? It's because primary care is broken, people are struggling to see a GP, no surprises there. We've lost 5,000 in the last decade. And social care, we've got delayed discharge charges.
But if you just go running to the private sector to fix the problems of the NHS, isn't that an acknowledgement, actually, that the NHS itself is failing? If a Labour government would turn to the private sector in a big way and give billions to big corporates,
it's absolutely an acknowledgement that Conservatives have run down the NHS. It's atrocious what's happened in the NHS.
But that would be about what you do in office, not about what the Conservatives have done.
I think it shows that we are focused on fixing the NHS, getting people access to treatment as fast as possible, and we are having to think radically about how we do that.
Well, on one of those plans, you're suggesting today that GPs, many of them, should become salaried members of staff under the NHS. Now, of course, at the moment, GPs have their own practices. They run them like small businesses. Would you buy out GP practices right around the country? And that sounds pretty expensive. How much would it cost?
No, we're going to consult on phasing out over time. That's already the trend, by the way. People who are coming into general practice now are less likely to become GP partners in the way that they have done previously. In fact, by 2026, salaried GPs are likely to be the majority. So the trend is already in that direction. But I'm looking at this as part of a much wider reform of primary care, because I think I said on your programme last time I was here, actually, when you compare the NHS to other healthcare systems, one of the things that I think makes us less effective is that we do late diagnosis, more expensive, less effective treatment, huge funding concentrated in hospitals. We need to scale up primary care, community service, neighbourhood NHS. That's exactly the direction that we need to go in.
When you say phasing out GP practice over time, though, do you actually mean, you know, categorically that you would get rid of, over a period of time, the concept of the GP practice being run by the doctors in charge, that they all become, you know, employees of the NHS? Is that what you would look to as an ambition?
Well, the GP partnership model, which has existed since the NHS was created, where, as you say, GPs effectively run themselves as small businesses, we are looking to phase that out. We're going to be consulting on that this year. But we've got to also scale up the number of GPs. General practice has such a critical role to play. It should be the best front door to the NHS, but at the moment it's broken, it's overwhelmed. We've lost 5,000 GPs in the last decade. That's having a big impact on patients, not the fault of GPs, it's the fault of the government.
But it's a big change to completely change that model. As you say yourself, it's been there since the beginning of the NHS. And you seem to have a bit of a beef with GPs. I mean, you've suggested that they get money for old rope for doing vaccinations.
No, I don't.
Beef with GPs?
I have a beef with the fact that people are waiting so long to see a GP. I have a beef with the fact that GPs are telling me that they're slogging their guts out, working late into the night. That's not a sustainable position either.
But
and in terms of
vaccination,
let me just clarify what I was saying on vaccinations, Laura. So I think pharmacy should do a lot more vaccination. Of course, there are GPs who say, well, hang on a minute, that's a big part of our income. We don't want to see other people doing vaccinations either. And I can understand
Is that a way to talk to a profession, to say that giving vaccinations to their patients, which may be life-saving, would certainly help them significantly with their health? Is that a way to talk to the profession, to say that they're charging money for old rope for providing health care?
The vaccination programme is absolutely critical to our country. GPs, pharmacies, and of course the huge Jabs Army of Volunteer did a brilliant job on the vaccine rollout, something the government takes credit for, but GPs, pharmacies and others delivered. So look, I'm not trying to insult a profession that's slogging their guts out and incredibly burned out. Quite the opposite. I want more GPs, I want more focus and investment investment in primary care. And over the course of the 10-year plan for change and reform that I'm working on with Keir Starmer, we want to shift the focus of healthcare out of the hospital into the community, faster access to diagnosis, better, more effective treatment and better value for the taxpayer.
And I'm sure we'll talk about that lots and more in the months to come. Some quick final questions. Should junior doctors get a pay rise of about 30%, which is what they appear to be asking for?
Well, I can understand the financial challenges that junior doctors face. I've raised those myself before. 30%, I can't honestly say if I was the Health Secretary today I'd be able to deliver that. But look at what the last Labour government did. Because we got the economy growing, we were able to invest in our public services and improve the pay of NHS staff, including pay restoration. But you can only do that if you've got a strong economy. And that's what the Conservatives have failed to deliver with a low growth, low productivity, high inflation economy.
And just a final interesting little question on something that's happening in other countries. Should buying cigarettes eventually be outlawed?
Well, we're going to consult on a whole package of measures to tackle smoking in this country. The government's not on course to meet its 2030 target. And one of the things that was recommended to the government in one of their own reviews was phasing out the sale of cigarettes altogether over time.
So
we'll be consulting on that and a whole range of other measures.
So that is something possibly a Labour government would outlaw, the sale, the buying, the smoking of cigarettes eventually.
Well, the New Zealand government are doing it. We want to see how that works. But I'm genuinely curious. If we're going to get the NHS back on track, we also need to focus on public health. And I'm curious to know where the voters are on this, where the country is, and what appetite exists for change. So we're going to have to think radically, Laura. What the government have done to the NHS is a disgrace. It's going to take time to fix it and fresh, radical thinking, and that's what Labour's about.
Well, maybe some voters this morning will tell us what they think of that idea. But
yeah,
for
good.
now, Wes Streeting, thank you so much for coming in. It's great to have you in the studio. Now, it's nearly 10 o'clock, and our main event today was Rishi Sunak's first big interview since he became Prime Minister. He wouldn't tell me whether he pays for private healthcare, but he did tell us the ministers are now ready to talk about this year's pay deal for nurses. A bit of a shift.
We just wrote to all the unions from across the public sector, inviting them in for talks. Now, and those talks are happening in many sectors on Monday, which is great. And when it comes to pay, we've always said we want to talk about things that are reasonable, that are affordable and responsible for the country.
Rishi Sunak there. Now let's have a final word with our excellent panel who've been with us throughout this morning. Pat Cullen, the leader of the Nurses Union, Andy Haldane, numbers supremo, and Clive Kay, the boss of one of the biggest hospitals in the country. Clive, I'm interested to know what you made of Wes Streeting's comments there about the NHS.
Yeah, the couple of things I think are very interesting, and we've not really touched on much today, this issue around health inequalities. So whether we use the private sector or not, we need to make sure we minimise the widening of the health inequalities, which have been, very significantly exposed by COVID. And I think you used the word radical. I think we need some radical solutions. As we've heard several times today, we can't go for quick fixes or sticking plasters. We need sustainable radical solutions.
OK, Andy Haldane, we're very short on time. Can you give us an optimistic prediction for the year?
Yeah, so last year started with hope and ended in despair. This year kicks off with despair. I'm hopeful we might have a degree of hope by the end of the year. And Sam Mendes' piece, set in Margate, an example of regeneration locally that's transformed things. Why not let's have that across every town and city in the UK?
Well, some politicians might call that levelling up, which I know you do a lot of work on, so come back and talk to us about that another time. But Pat, something optimistic?
Yes, optimism for this year will be if we get 47,000 unfilled nursing posts filled and nurses get a decent pay salary.
OK, all three of you, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Professor Kay, Andy Haldane and Pat Cullen. And of course, a huge thank you to you also for watching. Let's see if Rishi Sunak and Pat Cullen can get any closer to solving the strikes this week. It's good to have you all together with us again at the start of a new year. It's already a very tough one for the Prime Minister. Top of his list, sorting out the health service. He wouldn't use the word crisis, and he steadfastly refused to tell us if he and his family pay for their healthcare. Whether you think that matters much or not, it is sure to get tongues wagging in Westminster. And for all politicians, you know this. Questions don't disappear just because they don't want to answer them. More broadly, the desperate scenes in parts of the health service are highly likely to define a lot of the political arguments of the next couple of months. Next week, we will test out Keir Starmer's ambitions. He'll be here with us live. So as ever, tell us what you'd like to know in all the usual ways, and you can always catch up on the iPlayer, and there's tons more on the BBC website. It's great to be back. See you again next week. Goodbye.